Well, if you'd like to turn in your Bibles to the passage we just read, page 826, it's Habakkuk chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible, you will find one useful, so just raise your hand and someone should bring one to you. We're going to be looking at Habakkuk for the next 3 weeks in the evenings as a sort of mini-series. And I don't know what you were thinking as we read the passage earlier. You might have thought all this talk of violence and leopards and fishing nets was a little bit strange. Or you might have just never even heard of Habakkuk before, because it is quite it's a very small book. It's only 3 chapters long. It's just tucked away at the end of the Old Testament. It doesn't really get talked about very much. And it's a prophet too. And like many of the prophets in the Bible, it can be a bit strange to read, especially the first time we read it. But while it is a strange book in some ways, and maybe a little obscure, the themes of Habakkuk, the stuff it talks about, it can really be quite relevant to us, especially as Christians. Because perhaps more than anything else, this is a book about struggling to understand God and struggling to understand why he allows certain things to happen and not understanding why he acts in the way that he does. As Andy said earlier, one of the sort of unique things about Habakkuk is that it's a conversation. A lot of the other prophets in the Old Testament are pretty one way. God will speak to his people through a prophet. But in Habakkuk, the prophet speaks back. And so we get this back and forth between God and Habakkuk, as Habakkuk is struggling and wrestling, trying to understand God and trying to understand what he's doing. So in some ways, it's quite a personal book because we're listening in on this private conversation between God and his prophet. But in other ways, it's a book that takes place on a big scale, isn't it? Because it's talking about national events. There are 2 nations that are in view throughout this book. One is Judah, that's the southern kingdom of Israel, God's people. And the other is Babylon. So if you were with us in the morning services a couple months ago, you might remember we just finished going through Daniel together. Daniel is another Old Testament prophet, and that takes place in Babylon not long after Babylon's come and invaded Judah and taken the Jews off into exile. Habakkuk is probably set not too long before that, around maybe 650 to 600 BC, something like that. So at this point, Judah, they're still in the promised land, but they've fallen. They've fallen a really long way, and things are a mess. And they're about to get a lot worse because Babylon is coming. So that's the context, briefly. As we said, this is a conversation. And chapter 1 breaks down quite nicely into 3 little speeches. So verses 2 to 4, we get Habakkuk asking God his questions. And then in verses 5 to 11, God comes back with some answers. And then from verse 12 through to chapter 2, verse 1, we get more questions from Habakkuk. So we're just going to take each of these little speeches one at a time. So first of all then, verses 2 to 4. Hang on. Verses 2 to 4 is Habakkuk's question to God. Is that going to work? No, never mind. Not important. Verses 2 to 4, Habakkuk comes to God and he says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife, and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds." So Habakkuk, he's giving us a little snapshot of the state that Judah is in at this point, and it's really not good, is it? You can just pick out some of the words he uses: violence, iniquity, plundering, strife, contention. These are bad things. And if you wanted to sum this situation up in one word, the word you might use might be injustice. This is not fair, the situation Habakkuk is describing. Look at what he says in verse 4. He says, "The law is powerless." That word powerless, it can also be translated as paralyzed. And the law that he's talking about is God's law. So he's saying that God's law is paralyzed. It's numb. It can't move. It can't have any effect on Judah, on its people. And because of this, there's no justice. God's law is silenced and it is ignored. And so sin and injustice abound. Why is this then? Why does this happen? Well, it's because of human nature, isn't it? Human beings, we're not good. We are fundamentally flawed and broken. But the Bible tells us that we're made in the image of God. So we can reflect something of God's goodness. But if we're left to ourselves without him, without his law, then we become like this. We just descend into sin because at heart we're just not good. It's a bit like the moon. Bear with me with this. It's a bit like the moon. The moon has no light of its own, right? It just reflects light from the sun, doesn't it? But if you could somehow take the sun away, I don't know how you do that, but if you could, the moon wouldn't put forward any light at all, would it? It would just be dark. Judah are able to follow God's law when they have it. When they have God, they can reflect something of his goodness, but when they turn away from God, when they forget him, there's almost nothing good left. And we're really no better, are we, if we're honest with ourselves? When we forget God, when we turn away from God, we descend or can descend into a similar sort of sin and chaos because we're not good. And this is true for us individually, but it's also true on a national level, isn't it? As we can see from Judah. And yeah, while this nation, we might not have reached this same level of violence in the streets that Habakkuk is talking about, we are a nation that is slowly but surely turning its back on God. And whilst we hope that we don't reach the state that Habakkuk is describing here, this is the direction we will go in inevitably if we depart from God's law. It will happen because we are sinful at heart. If we forget God as a nation, then like Judah, we will just descend and descend into this sin until there's almost nothing good left. And that just reminds us, doesn't it, of the importance of praying for our nation, praying for our country, asking God to help our leaders, asking God to help our country, that we would stop turning away from God, that this nation would come back to him, and that his law and his justice might be found here. Now, maybe one objection to that idea that we need God's law as a nation to be good is look at the church, right? Because the church supposedly has God's law and it knows God, but it seems like only every few months there's another church leader who's disgraced by something terrible they did in the past. And Christians do fail pretty consistently, it seems, to live lives worthy of our calling, and that's terrible, that's tragic. And if you think about it, the situation that Habakkuk is describing here is tragic in a similar sort of way, because this isn't just any nation he's talking about. This is Judah. This is Israel. This is God's people. God made a covenant with them. God promised to be their God, and here they are turning their backs on him. And so there's a danger, isn't there, that the church can be like Judah. Because Christians, we have a share in the promises of God. We are his people, just like Judah was, but we're still capable of turning our backs on him and of failing him, failing to reflect his goodness. And so as well as praying for our nation, we should pray for the church too, both locally and on a wider level, that we don't do that we don't forget God, that we don't forget his law, and that God would transform us and remake us as a church so that we can reflect his goodness. But anyway, Judah, God's people, they have turned away from him. And they've descended into this horrible state of sin and injustice and violence. And Habakkuk's question to God, quite understandably really, is, God, where are you? Right? Because as far as Habakkuk can tell, it almost seems like God isn't noticing. It almost seems like he doesn't care. Look at what he says in verse 2. He says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear?" So it seems like Habakkuk's been crying out to God for a long time, and nothing's happened. Now, we're going to see as we carry on through this chapter that God was listening and that something does happen. But that doesn't change the fact that right now, for Habakkuk, in this situation, God feels very, very distant. Right? It feels to Habakkuk like God doesn't care. And maybe you can identify with that in some way. Maybe you think about the state of our country or the church, or maybe even your own personal sin, and you're sad because God lets things get worse and worse, it seems. And it seems like he's not doing anything. It seems like he might not even care. And if we're honest, there are times, even as believers, when despite our best efforts to make sense of things, even with the help of Scripture and prayer, we still can't figure it out. We still don't know what God is doing or why he's doing it. And that's what Habakkuk experiences here. His heart is breaking because Judah have fallen so far from God, and he's confused because God doesn't seem to be doing anything. And that doesn't make sense to him. But in some ways, Habakkuk is a bit of a role model for us in this, because whilst we might not be prophets and have this kind of direct conversation with God that he does, we can experience this kind of confusion and desperation, can't we? And Habakkuk, he doesn't have all the answers. He doesn't have the answers to the situation he's in. And despite his prayers, things aren't getting better, but he keeps praying. And I think that's key. He keeps seeking God, even when God seems silent and distant. And he does that for as long as it takes. He might be confused and he might be miserable, but he doesn't turn his back on God. Even though the rest of Judah has, he stays faithful for as long as it takes. And this is speculating a little bit, but we don't really know how long it does take for Habakkuk to get his answer. God answers in verse 5, which comes after verse 4, obviously. But there could be a 10-year gap between verses 4 and 5 for all we know. We don't know. This whole book is 3 chapters long, but Habakkuk could have spent his whole life praying and writing this. We have no idea. But what we do know is that however long it did take for him to get his answers, and however hurt and confused he might have been waiting for them, he stayed faithful to God, and he kept praying, and he kept coming to God, even when it seemed like God wasn't listening. And that's no easy thing to do, is it? But I think his example can be quite inspiring for us. But of course, God is listening, and however long it might take for him to answer, his answer does eventually come to Habakkuk. So let's move on to verses 5 to 11. God starts his answer in verse 5 and says, "Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days which you would not believe, though it were told you." So God starts his answer with a bang, almost, doesn't it? It's almost like he's saying to Habakkuk, well, did you think I wasn't listening? Did you think I didn't care? Just watch. Watch what I'm about to do and be amazed. God is working, even when we don't think he is. He is listening, even when he seems silent. But he's not always working in the ways that we expect or the ways that we can understand, as we can see from his answer. Look at verse 6. God says to Habakkuk, "For indeed I'm raising up the Chaldeans," that's Babylon. "I'm raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs." So these Chaldeans, that's the Babylonians, that's Babylon. But actually that word Chaldean literally might mean something like conqueror. Right? So God's answer to all of this injustice and sin in Judah is Babylon. Right? He's going to use Babylon to judge Judah. Judah's turned away from him. Now he punishes them. And that's justice. But maybe that doesn't sit very well with you, because you could also look at it and think, well, hang on, why is he doing this? Because Judah's been suffering. Judah's in pain. There's violence in Judah. Why is he sending this invading army to come and judge them? Is God answering suffering with more suffering? That doesn't seem right. There's some verses that might help us to get a better grasp of what's going on here. These verses from Proverbs chapter 3. Is this going to work? Yeah. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 to 12 say, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves. As a father, the son he delights in." God disciplines and he punishes those that he loves, like a good parent disciplines their children. Ultimately, it's for the child's benefit, even though it doesn't seem like that at the time. Judah are God's children, but they've turned away from him, and they've forgotten his law, and they've descended into this horrible state of sin. But God, because he loves them, can't leave them there. Right? He can't leave them in the state that they're in. So he raises up Babylon as a tool, like an instrument to discipline them, to punish them, so that over time, they'll come back to him. Things have to get worse before they can get better for Judah. But ultimately, God is doing this to save them from their own sin and to bring them back to him. And God can work in similar ways today, can't he? Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, our suffering and our pain is discipline from God, isn't it? It can be meant as a kind of course correction to get us back on track, to push us away from the sin that's harming us and get us back to God. Now, far be it from me or anyone else to say that your pain is punishment from God. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying that it can be, that God can work in this way, and that we should be open to that. Right? As these verses from Proverbs say, we shouldn't despise God's discipline. We shouldn't resent it, but we should be open to it, open to receiving that correction from God, because ultimately, he's doing it to bring us back to him. He's doing it for our good. But there's another problem in these verses that maybe it occurred to you as we were reading, and that's something like this. God is sovereign, right? God is in control over everything. He's behind Babylon's invasion of Judah, right? He's sending Babylon. That's basically what he's telling Habakkuk. God is using Babylon. So does that mean that Babylon's innocent, right? If Babylon's being used, does that mean they're not to blame? Well, you could talk about that all evening, but the short answer is no. Babylon is guilty. And the short answer to that, again, is that God isn't making Babylon do anything they don't want to do, right? Babylon wants to do this. Babylon wants to invade Judah. They want to cause this suffering. And that becomes clear to us in the next verses where God reveals to Habakkuk what the Babylonians are thinking and what it is that's motivating them, what's driving them. And the answer is basically pride. Pride. Babylon is strong, it's powerful, it's this invading force that sweeps into countries and conquers them. It takes what doesn't belong to it, and it's always hungry for more, like some sort of wild animal. But Babylon sees its strength and its power and what it's able to do, and it's proud of it. Right? Look at verse 7. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. It's like their sense of worth comes from themselves and what they can do. They're proud of themselves. They're proud of their achievements and of their strength. And they see themselves as being above everyone else because if any other country stands in their way, they just sweep them aside. But it goes further than this. If you look down to verse 11, then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. Now, that translation that we have is maybe a bit misleading. A lot of other translations have something more along these lines. So this is from the NIV. It's the same verse, just a different translation. They sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty people whose own strength is their God, right? Whose own strength is their God. Babylon is so proud of itself, so proud of its strength, so proud of what it can do that it makes its strength a god. It worships its own strength. It worships its own ability. But remember, God has raised up Babylon, right? God has made them strong because God is using them to punish Judah. But Babylon, they're so far from God that rather than being grateful for that, they set up their own strength as a god. That Babylon is proud and Babylon is guilty. And pride is a terrible sin, isn't it? Everything good that we have, our possessions, our wealth, or our strength, it all comes from God, doesn't it? And pride essentially forgets this. It ignores it and says, no, everything I have is mine because I'm great and I earned it. It's an insult, isn't it? It's a terrible insult to God, pride, because it says, what I have is mine because I'm great and I deserve it. But if we're rich, it's because God made us rich, or if we're strong, it's really because God made us strong. And to say that we made ourselves strong or something like that is an insult to God. But this is what Babylon is doing. This is Babylon's pride. And in a way, it's their biggest sin because it's fueling everything else they're doing, all of their killing and their conquest. Babylon is doing just to feed this sense of pride and their own self-worth that they have. And even though God is using this, he's using this pride and this power to judge Judah, Babylon will still have to answer to God for their sin. But Habakkuk, he kind of gets this, but he doesn't quite get it all yet. So he comes back to God with more questions. So verse 12, Habakkuk comes to God and says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction." So Habakkuk, he comes back to God and he starts his response really by showing how much he trusts God, doesn't he? And that's really important, isn't it? He still has big questions. He still has stuff that he needs to figure out, but he starts from this place of trust. Yeah, he says to God, "God, are you not from everlasting? God is everlasting. He won't die. He won't change." And because of that, Habakkuk can then say, "We shall not die." The "we" there is probably Judah. So Habakkuk is saying, God, because you're everlasting, because you endure forever, we, the nation of Judah, will survive. And that's because Judah, they're still God's children, aren't they? They're still his people. They might have turned their backs on him. They might have pushed him away. And he's going to judge them. He's going to punish them, but they're still his children. And they might have forgotten him, but he has not forgotten them. And he continues to sustain them and to uphold them so that they will not die, so that they will survive this. They will survive Babylon, not because they're any better than Babylon or any stronger, because they're not, but because God is stronger than Babylon. And Habakkuk, he recognizes that God he's appointed them for judgment. That's Babylon. He's marked Babylon for correction. So he recognizes that God is using Babylon to correct and to judge Judah. But did you notice that in the midst of all this judgment and discipline, that Habakkuk calls God his rock? At the end of verse 12, "O rock, you have marked them for correction." Right? Even in the midst of all this suffering and judgment, God is still Judah's rock. Even when God disciplines us and judges us, if we are his children, he is still our rock. And he sustains us and he supports us even as he's disciplining us. And so even if we are under God's discipline in some way, even if we feel that our pain is coming from God, that doesn't mean that we have to stop relying on him. It doesn't mean we have to stop trusting him. We can still come to him in prayer, just like Habakkuk does, and trust him to bring us through to the other side. And that is what Habakkuk is doing here. He's trusting God to bring him and to bring the rest of Judah through to the other side of this. But he still has questions. And we see that as we read on. Verse 13, Habakkuk says, "God, you are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he?" So essentially, Habakkuk's problem is this. He says, okay, God, you can't tolerate sin. You're just. You can't tolerate sin, and I know that. And Judah has fallen into this horrible state of sin, so you're using Babylon to punish them, and I understand that. But Babylon is wicked too, isn't it? Babylon has its own sin, arguably even worse than Judah's. They're proud and they're terrible, these Babylonians, but God is raising them up and he's giving them strength. God will punish Judah's sins, but what about Babylon's? Right? Isn't Babylon guilty as well? Is he going to let them get away with this forever? This doesn't seem right to Habakkuk because he knows that God is just, and it shouldn't seem right to us either. And in the next verses 14 through to 17, Habakkuk, he illustrates this problem for us with this slightly odd picture of a fisherman. I don't know what you thought of this as we read it. But in this picture, the nations that Babylon has invaded, they're pictured as fish in the sea. And Babylon is a fisherman. And Babylon, this fisherman, comes along and catches all the fish, all the nations in its net. And it takes them and it conquers them. But then things get a bit strange, don't they? In verse 16, therefore they, that's this fisherman, sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their dragnet. So the fisherman has caught so many fish using this wonderful net that he decides, I'm going to worship it. He's going to worship his net. You know, there's that old phrase, isn't there? A bad workman blames his tools. Well, this workman worships them. It's stupid, isn't it? It's really stupid. And Habakkuk, he's showing just how outrageous and ridiculous Babylon's pride is. God gave them this net, this strength that they have. But instead of being grateful for it and thankful to it, they worship it. They big themselves up because they're proud. Babylon's sin, Babylon's pride is outrageous. And Habakkuk's next question in verse 17 is shall they therefore empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? So, in other words, God, how much longer are you going to let them get away with this? Babylon's about to do all of these terrible, horrible things, and it looks like God's fine with it, and he's going to let them get away with it. And again, this doesn't seem right to Habakkuk, and it shouldn't seem right to us. And he can't get his head around it. Now, of course, God won't let Babylon get away with this forever. And he will come back to Habakkuk again with another answer, but that's later on in chapter 2. So come back next week. There's more than we can look at this evening. But in some ways, that's kind of nice because it leaves us on a little bit of a cliffhanger, if you like, with chapter 2, verse 1, which is where Habakkuk's speech ends. Chapter 2, verse 1, he says, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. So this passage ends with Habakkuk waiting, doesn't it? And again, there could be a huge gap between Habakkuk's question and God's answer that comes from verse 2. We don't know, again, but we do know that he's prepared to wait, and he does wait. He pictures himself as a soldier or a lookout, standing on a tower, watching and waiting for God's answer. And it's a wonderful example and a wonderful picture of how we are to wait on God and question God. Habakkuk doesn't know what God is going to say to him, right? He also doesn't know what he's going to say to God. Do you notice? He says, I will watch to see what he will say to me, what God will say to me, and what I will answer. So he's not coming to God with an agenda. Right? He has his questions. He has his problems and his things that he's trying to figure out. But he doesn't come to God with an agenda. He doesn't come shouting at him or telling him he's wrong or placing blame on God. He just asks his questions, and then he watches and he waits for God's response, however long that might take. And this isn't blissful ignorance. It's not that Habakkuk doesn't care what the answers are. And it's not that we shouldn't care about God's answers. We should. We should care about God's answers. Habakkuk wants to know. He wants to know how God is going to deal with this situation. He wants to know how Judah can be saved from its sin. He wants to know how Babylon is going to be dealt with. But he trusts God. He trusts him enough to wait, and to wait patiently for his response. And that can be really relevant for us, can't it? Christians, we have to do a lot of waiting sometimes. We can have pains and questions now that might not be resolved for a very, very long time. We might have to wait years for God to answer our prayers or our questions, or to solve our problems, or to end our suffering. We might have to wait a very long time, but as we wait, like Habakkuk, we can trust in God, can't we? We can trust in our rock to sustain us and to bring us through the waiting. And we can be sure that God's answers will come in the end. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 writes this. He says, "For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. For now, we see only a reflection, as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." So we can know some things now, can't we? Paul says we can know in part. We prophesy in part. We can know that God is just. We can know that God can't tolerate sin. We can know that God is sovereign and in control over individuals, over nations. We can know that God is good. We can know that God loves his children, that he loves his church, and that if they stray from him, he will go to great pains to bring them back. And we know that we are saved by the blood of Jesus. But we can't know everything, not just yet. And we can't have all the answers just yet. For some things, we will have to wait a very, very long time, maybe even a lifetime. But when completeness comes, when Jesus Christ returns, all injustice will be made right, and all sin will be dealt with, and all problems will be solved. Until then, we need to be like Habakkuk, don't we? We watch and we wait and we hope, and we rely on Jesus, rely on our rock to sustain us and to keep us until he comes again.